Have you ever noticed how the absolute worst things happen in complete and utter silence? No warning signs, no dramatic music, just a sudden, freezing realization that you aren't as alone as you thought you were. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, pull up a chair, dim your lights, and make yourself comfortable. But whatever you do, don't let the room get too quiet. For months, I've been digging through the absolute deepest, most forgotten depths of Reddit. I bypassed the popular threads, skipped the viral hits, and searched the dark corners where people post the things they are too terrified to admit out loud. And what I uncovered there changed how I look at empty spaces forever. These aren't just creepy tales. These are the encounters that were buried, forgotten, left in the dark, until now. The question is, are you truly ready for the untold horror stories of Reddit? Let's begin.
The static in the floorboards. Part 1, the listing on Route 9. I'm posting this here because I don't know where else to put it. If you listen to those late-night horror podcasts, you've probably heard dozens of stories about cheap houses with dark histories. You always think, why didn't they just leave? You think that until you're the one holding a lease, looking at a bank account with $92 left in it, realizing that leaving means sleeping in your sedan during a northeast winter. It was November when I found the listing. The ad on Craigslist didn't even have photos, just a short block of text, single-family cottage off Route 9. Quiet area. $650 a month, utilities included. Must be comfortable with isolation. In 2026, finding anything under $2,000 is a miracle. I called the number immediately. The landlord, a guy named Arthur who sounded like he smoked a pack of unfiltered cigarettes for breakfast, didn't even want to meet me at the property. He just told me the front door was unlocked, the keys were on the kitchen counter, and if I wanted it, I could drop the first month's cash in a lockbox downtown. Just one thing, Arthur had said, his voice cracking like dry autumn leaves over the line. The house settles. Old timber. It vibrates a bit in the evenings. If you're a sensitive sleeper, you might feel a shift. I can handle it, I told him, practically vibrating with relief. If only I had asked what kind of vibration. The cottage sat at the end of a long, unpaved driveway choked with overgrown pine trees. It was a small, saltbox-style house, its white clapboard siding faded to a sickly, water-stained gray. The woods pressed in tight against the back porch, so close that the branches of a massive, dead oak tree loomed directly over the master bedroom window. When I pushed the front door open, the scent hit me instantly. It wasn't the smell of rot, not exactly. It smelled like a basement that hadn't seen sunlight in 50 years, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of copper and old dust. It was heavy. The air felt thick, like walking through water. But the rent was $650. So, I signed the papers, dropped the cash in Arthur's box, and moved my life into the saltbox house within 48 hours. Part 2, the tuning. For the first 3 nights, everything was normal. Well, as normal as it could be in a house that felt like it was constantly holding its breath. I'm a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my nights sitting at my desk, bathed in the blue glow of my monitor. That's probably why it took me until the 4th night to notice the shift. It started around 11:14 p.m. I know the exact time because I glanced down at my taskbar when my mouse cursor began to judder. At first, I thought it was just a wave of dizziness. But it wasn't. It was a high-frequency micro-vibration. I sat perfectly still. The air in the room was trembling. I stood up, and the moment my bare feet touched the hardwood floor, a wave of mild nausea hit me. The vibration was pulsing through the soles of my feet, traveling up my shins. It felt exactly like standing too close to a massive subwoofer, except there was absolutely no physical sound. There was no hum, no rumble, no mechanical noise. Just an oppressive, rhythmic pressure in the atmosphere that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I walked out into the living room. The kitchen. The bathroom. The vibration was everywhere, but it felt strongest in the center of the house, right where the hallway met the living room rug. I knelt down and pressed my palm flat against the floorboards. The wood was ice cold. And beneath the surface, it felt like something was spinning. Not a machine. Machines have a predictable cadence. This felt organic. Like a massive, collective pulse. Like thousands of tiny unseen things shifting their weight against the underside of the wood in perfect, terrifying unison. Then came the audio. It didn't come from the room. It came from inside my ears, the way a severe case of tinnitus does. It was a low, undulating whine, like a radio dial being turned slowly between stations, catching nothing but dead air and distant, mangled static. It was a phantom noise, trapped entirely inside my skull. I stood there in the dark hallway, shivering, my teeth clicking together from the sheer frequency of the tension, until exactly midnight. At 12 a.m. on the dot, it stopped. The sudden absence of pressure was deafening. The nausea vanished instantly, leaving behind a sharp, throbbing headache behind my eyes. I stood in the dark for a long time, listening to nothing but my own ragged breathing, before finally shaking it off. Just a strange inner ear issue, I muttered aloud, trying to force my voice to sound brave in the empty house. Just a pressure drop. But deep down, I knew a pressure drop didn't make your skull feel like it was cracking open. Part 3, The Voices in the Dead Air. By the second week, the tuning, as I began to call it, became a nightly routine. Every evening at 11:14 p.m., the house would begin to tremble. Every night at midnight, it would stop. I tried to adapt. I bought heavy rugs. I tried wearing earplugs, but nothing worked. The vibration bypassed every barrier I threw at it, radiating straight through my bones. I started losing weight. I couldn't eat dinner past 6 because the nightly nausea would just bring it back up. My skin took on a gray, exhausted pallor, and dark purple bags sagged beneath my eyes. But the human brain is a strange thing. It can rationalize almost anything if the alternative means admitting you're losing your mind. I told myself it was infrasound. Maybe there was an underground fault line settling deep beneath the earth. Then came Tuesday. It was raining heavily, a cold, driving downpour. The storm had knocked out the internet, so I was sitting on the couch, reading a book by the light of a battery-powered lantern. At 11:14 p.m., the floorboards began to tremble. I braced myself, closing my eyes and waiting for the familiar, agonizing pressure to fill my head. The internal static started right on cue. But tonight, the radio dial wasn't just spinning through dead air. Tonight, it was finding a signal. Amidst the mental white noise, a sound broke through. It was faint, buried under layers of mental distortion, but it was unmistakably a human voice. Please. I froze. I stopped breathing, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The static flared up in my mind, drowning it out for a few seconds. Then, the signal cleared. It was a woman's voice. It sounded flat, hollow, and incredibly distant, as if she were speaking into a microphone from the bottom of a deep, concrete well. Is anyone on this frequency? It's cold. The walls are so close. Please, turn the dial. I scrambled off the couch. I fell to my knees in the middle of the living room, pressing my ear directly against the cold, vibrating hardwood. The smell of copper and wet dust was overwhelming, choking my throat. Can't turn around. The voice wept from beneath the floor. The wood is in my mouth. Please, whoever is listening, don't let them change the station. Who is that? I screamed at the floorboards, my voice cracking with pure terror. Where are you? The moment I spoke, the static went dead silent. The vibration stopped instantly, even though my watch read 11:43 p.m. It had never stopped early before. I stayed on my hands and knees, staring at the grain of the wood. The house was dead quiet. There was no creaking, no tapping, no sound at all. Just a profound, suffocating silence. And then, I felt a distinct pressure against the palm of my hand. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical push. Two short, deliberate nudges from directly beneath the wood, pressing upward against my skin. Part 4, The Research. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car with the heater blasting, staring at the dark silhouette of the cottage until the sun finally cracked through the gray November clouds. As soon as the local library opened at 9 a.m., I was through the doors. I couldn't look up property records online because the internet was still down out by the highway, so I had to use the library's microfiche archives of the county newspaper. It took me 3 hours of scrolling through obituaries and local property transfers to find it. The house hadn't always been a rental. In the late 1990s, it belonged to a family named Vance. Arthur, my landlord, was the youngest son. In 1998, his older sister, Sarah Vance, a 22-year-old college student, vanished from the home. The newspaper articles were sparse, paint-by-numbers missing persons reports at first. Local woman disappears from rural home. No signs of forced entry. But it was the follow-up article 6 months later that turned my blood to ice. The police had called off the active search, but the father, Thomas Vance, had lost his grip on reality. He had become convinced that his daughter hadn't left the property. The article detailed how neighbors had grown concerned over his behavior. When the police finally went out to the house with a wellness warrant, they found that Thomas had systematically torn up the floorboards, the drywall, and the ceiling panels throughout the entire house. He had spent months digging narrow, human-sized trenches beneath the foundations, crawling into the crawlspaces with a flashlight, calling his daughter's name into the dark. They found him dead in the crawlspace. The official cause of death was positional asphyxiation. He had wedged himself into a gap between the foundation stone and the main support beams, a space less than 11 inches wide, and had been unable to back out. The article quoted a police spokesperson. It appears Mr. Vance believed he heard his daughter speaking through the structural timbers of the home. We found no evidence of any second party beneath the house. I sat back in the library chair, staring at the blurry black and white photo of Thomas Vance. His eyes were wide, sunken, and haunted. He looked exactly how I felt. Part 5, The Static Takes Shape. I should have packed my bags and never gone back. If I had been sane, if I hadn't been so utterly drained by sleep deprivation, I would have abandoned my $92 and slept anywhere else. But terror has a way of turning into an obsession. I needed to know if I was crazy. I needed to know if the voice was real. I drove back to the cottage as the twilight was fading into a bruised, purple dark. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't open my laptop. I just sat in the center of the living room floor with a flashlight and my phone set to record audio. 11:13 p.m. My watch ticked over to 11:14. Right on the second, the floorboards began to tremble. The micro-vibrations were violent tonight, sending a physical shudder straight up my spine. The static flooded my brain, but it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was an entire internal soundscape. I heard the mental impression of liquid ripping apart, like wet sheets being torn in half. I felt the rhythmic, sickening sensation of something heavy dragging itself through thick fluid. And then, the radio dial in my head clicked into place. The signal was perfect. Crystal clear. But it wasn't Sarah Vance's voice anymore. It was mine. Is anyone on this frequency? My own voice echoed inside my skull, sounding flat, hollow, and utterly devoid of hope. It's cold. The walls are so close. Please, turn the dial. I gasped, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam sweeping across the room, illuminating the baseboards. The static in my head shifted into a chaotic frenzy of voices, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all overlapping, all screaming, crying, and begging on different frequencies. It sounded like an entire stadium of people trapped inside a radio transmitter, all trying to speak through a single, broken speaker inside my mind. And beneath the floorboards, the wood began to warp. There was no sound of splintering or cracking. In complete, horrific silence, the seams between the hardwood planks simply widened, pulling apart like soft flesh. A thick, dark, oily substance began to ooze upward through the cracks. It didn't smell like copper anymore. It smelled like old copper mixed with the distinct, unmistakable stench of a decay so ancient it felt primordial. The floorboards in the center of the room began to bow upward, as if something incredibly massive was pressing its back against the underside of the wood, trying to break through. Through the gap, I didn't see the dirt of the crawl space. I didn't see pipes or wires. I saw a face. It was made of living static. It was a shifting, undulating mass of gray and white pixels, constantly reforming, tearing itself apart, and stitching itself back together. It had no eyes, just two dark, hollow depressions where I should have been, and a wide, gaping maw that opened in a silent, eternal shriek. The thing pressed its face against the gap in the floorboards. The frequency of the vibration hit such a pitch that my nose began to bleed, hot, metallic fluid pouring over my upper lip. The air pressure dropped so violently my ears popped, and the sheer force of the nausea threw me onto my side. The static face extended upward out of the floor. It didn't have hands, it had tendrils of raw, vibrating frequency that reached toward my boots. With the last surge of adrenaline my body could muster, I dragged myself backward, away from the center of the room. I scrambled on my hands and knees across the floor, totally blind to everything but the exit. I kicked the front door open, tumbling out into the freezing November rain. Behind me, from inside the house, the voices didn't stop. They echoed out of the open door, bouncing off the pine trees, filling my head with a horrific, synchronized chorus of my own voice, Sarah Vance's voice, and hundreds of others. Don't let them change the station, don't let them change the station. I scrambled into my sedan, my wet hands slipping on the steering wheel. I shoved the key into the ignition and slammed on the gas. I roared down the driveway, never once looking in the rearview mirror. Part 6, the dial is still turning. That was 3 weeks ago. I never went back for my things. I didn't care about my computer, my clothes, or my graphics tablet. I left them all in that Saltbox house on Route 9. I called Arthur from a payphone near the state line to tell him I was breaking the lease. He didn't ask why. He didn't get angry. He just listened to me breathe for a long moment before whispering, "I told you to be careful," and hanging up. I'm living in a motel now, 2 states over. It's a cheap, busy place right next to an interstate highway. I chose it on purpose. I needed the constant, chaotic visual movement of real-world traffic to distract my mind. But it isn't working. 2 nights ago, the motel's internet went down. I woke up in the dark, my heart pounding, a cold sweat drenching my sheets. The room was dead silent. Then, I felt it. A tiny, high-frequency tremble in the mattress. I held my breath. And there, buried deep inside the cartilage of my own skull, the static began to play. It was faint, so faint I could almost pretend I was imagining it. But the signal is getting stronger every hour. The dial is turning. It's searching for me. If you're listening to this late at night, if you're driving down a dark highway or sitting alone in a quiet room with your headphones on, do me a favor. Keep your mind busy. Talk to someone. Keep moving. Because if you let the silence linger for too long, you might start to feel the tremble. And once you feel it, you become part of the broadcast.
Story 2. The Left Behind Room. Part 1. The Open Panel. I spent the summer of 2025 working a preservation gig for a historical society in New England, cataloging old architectural blue line prints. It's the kind of tedious, solitary work that either makes you incredibly peaceful or intensely paranoid. For me, it was a mix of both. Most of the records were housed in the climate-controlled archive room of a converted late Victorian estate. The air in there was kept at a strict, uniform coolness, completely dead and artificially dried to protect the centuries-old paper. There were no windows, no ventilation hum, just rows of steel flat files stretching into the dim corners. On a Thursday afternoon, I was pulling a heavy drawer of structural diagrams from 1904 when the back of the cabinet shifted. It didn't make a sound, but I felt a distinct release of air pressure against my face, like a faint, stale breath escaping a vacuum. I leaned over the steel casing and realized the back panel of the cabinet had pushed inward. Behind it lay a narrow, unlisted gap in the estate's masonry, a hidden architectural void less than 3 feet wide, leading straight into the structural core of the house. Curiosity is a terrible thing when you're alone in a basement. I pulled my phone out, turned on the screen's glow, and squeezed my shoulders through the gap. The air inside the hidden space was entirely different from the archive. It was heavy, wet, and smelled intensely of old tallow and stagnant rain. The walls were unplastered brick, rough and cold to the touch. But what caught my attention was a narrow set of wooden steps leading upward into the absolute dark. They weren't standard stairs. They were incredibly steep, almost like a ladder built directly into the narrowest part of the wall cavity. I climbed. I didn't think about structural integrity or safety. I just moved upward in the absolute stillness, my bare palms pressing against the freezing stone walls for balance, until the steps ended at a low, unpainted wooden door. Part 2. The negative space. The door wasn't locked. It didn't even have a latch. When I pressed my hand against it, it simply drifted inward without a whisper. I stepped into a room that shouldn't have existed. According to the property's official blueprints, this section of the upper floor was solid negative space, a thick, dead zone designed purely to balance the exterior symmetry of the roofline. The room was completely bare. No forniture, no wallpaper, no floorboards, just raw, exposed framing timbers and the backside of the exterior plaster walls. It was incredibly small, perhaps 6 feet square, but the ceiling went up into a sharp, towering point. The atmosphere in that room hit me like a physical weight. It felt as though the air pressure was dropping rapidly, pulling the oxygen straight out of my lungs. My chest felt tight, and a thick, metallic taste swirled at the back of my throat. But the most unsettling thing was the absolute lack of external sensation. I knew, logically, that the estate sat right next to a busy state route. I had watched cars driving past before I came downstairs. Yet, standing in that space, there was no vibration from the road, no distant rumble of engines, no wind against the roof. It was as if the room existed in a total sensory vacuum, entirely severed from the rest of the physical world. I held my phone up to illuminate the far corner, and that's when I noticed the markings. Etched directly into the dry, chalky plaster of the wall were hundreds of tiny, horizontal lines. They were tightly packed together, arranged in neat, desperate columns like someone counting days. But they weren't scratched with a tool or a knife. The edges of the indentations were smooth and slightly rounded. They had been pressed into the plaster with human fingernails while the material was still wet. Part 3. The weight in the wall. I felt a sudden, sharp wave of vertigo, my knees buckling slightly. The silence in the room began to take on a strange, rhythmic density. It didn't have a sound, but it had a pulse, slow, suffocating expansion and contraction of the air that matched the steady beat of my own heart. Then, the cold began to bleed through the floor. I was wearing thin-soled sneakers, but the freezing temperature of the raw timber joists radiated right through them, turning my feet entirely numb within seconds. The cold didn't feel atmospheric. It felt deliberate, spreading outward from the dark corners of the room toward the center where I stood. I backed up toward the narrow door, intending to leave and never look back. But as my heel touched the threshold, the air pressure shifted violently. A deep, internal pull developed in the center of the room. It felt exactly like the suction created when a large vehicle speeds past you on a highway, dragging your body toward it. The air was being drawn inward toward the pointed peak of the ceiling, pulling the hair on my head upward, stretching the skin across my face tight. Amidst that violent, silent pull, I felt a distinct sensation against my shoulder. It wasn't a hand. It was a cold, localized density in the air, pressing firmly against my collarbone, trying to steer my weight away from the exit and back into the center of the negative space. It felt like walking into a thick wall of unseen water, an invisible presence holding its position in the dark. I didn't scream. My throat was too dry, the air too thin to catch a breath. I simply leaned my entire weight forward, fighting the unnatural suction, and tumbled backward through the low doorway, dropping straight onto the steep wooden steps. I scrambled down the ladder in complete darkness, my hands slipping on the rough brick walls, until I burst back through the steel flat file cabinet into the archive room. Part 4. The unwritten record. The next morning, I went to the supervisor's office. I didn't tell her what I experienced, but I asked her about the unlisted structural voids in the 1904 blueprints. She stopped typing, her face flattening into a completely blank, expressionless mask. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the monitor screen. The architects of that era had a lot of theories about structural balance, she said, her voice dropping into a flat, practiced monotony. Sometimes, to keep a house stable, you have to build a space that holds nothing. You leave a part of the layout unassigned. If you find one of those spaces, you close the panel. You don't catalog it. Why? I asked, my hands trembling against my thighs. Because a house that size has an immense amount of weight, she whispered, finally turning her eyes to meet mine. They were bloodshot and completely hollow. And if you don't give that weight an empty room to settle into, it will find a place in the rooms you're using. I quit the job that afternoon. I packed my car and drove straight out of the state, keeping the radio playing at full volume the entire time. But I can still feel the drop in pressure. Every night, exactly when the room gets completely still before I fall asleep, the air around my bed grows thick, cold, and heavy. The negative space didn't stay in the estate. It's still settling, and I think it's finally found a place in the room I'm using. Story 3. The Deepest Station. Part 1. The Platform Beyond the Gate. If you've ever ridden the subway system in a major city past midnight, you know how surreal the architecture becomes. The bright, crowded tile tunnels turn into hollow, echoing concrete vaults. The air shifts from the hot, friction-baked scent of brakes to a cold, subterranean dampness that feels like it belongs in a cavern, not a transit system. In October of 2025, I was working late-night track inspection for the Transit Authority. My job was simple. Walk the service ledges during the 3-hour maintenance window when the third rail is deactivated, looking for structural water seepage or micro fissures in the tunnel arches. It was a Tuesday night when I found the bypass gate. We were working a deep-level line that had been bored directly through the bedrock beneath the river. The tunnel walls here were solid, dark granite, reinforced with heavy iron rings. While checking a drainage weep hole, my light caught a rusted iron gate set deep into a natural recess in the rock face. It wasn't on our modern maintenance maps. There was no padlock, no warning sign, just a heavy iron bar dropped across a frame that looked like it hadn't been touched since the system was originally dug in the early 1900s. My partner was nearly a quarter mile ahead of me, his flashlight a distant, bouncing speck in the dark tunnel. I should have called out to him. I should have kept walking. But there was a strange, rhythmic pull coming from behind that gate. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical sensation in the air, a slow, deep inhalation of cold, atmospheric pressure that seemed to drag the dust into the gap. I lifted the heavy iron bar. It was completely weightless in my hands, sliding upward without resistance or friction. I pushed the gate open and stepped through. Part 2. The level with no name. Behind the gate, a long, unlined rock tunnel sloped sharply downward, away from the active subway line. The ground beneath my boots changed from concrete to smooth, hard-packed earth. As I walked, the distant, faint hum of the city above completely bled away. The silence became so absolute that I could hear the internal mechanics of my own body. The dry click of my throat when I swallowed, the steady rushing of blood through the veins in my ears. After 5 minutes of descending, the tunnel opened up into a massive, vaulted chamber. I shone my flashlight around, and my breath caught. It was an abandoned subway platform, but the design was completely wrong. The platform was built entirely out of a dark, polished stone that looked like obsidian, perfectly smooth and reflective. There were no tracks, just a deep, bottomless trench cut into the center of the room, cutting through the dark stone like a black scar. There were no signs, no benches, no light fixtures. But the air was completely alive with a violent, non-audible frequency. It was a micro-tremor so intense that it made my vision blur. The dark stone of the platform wasn't moving, but the air above it was warping, creating a heavy, visual distortion like heat rising off asphalt. The atmospheric pressure was immense, pushing against my chest, making every breath feel like I was inhaling wet cement. I walked to the edge of the deep trench and tilted my flashlight downward. The light didn't hit a bottom. It didn't hit tracks. The beam just faded into a dense, velvety blackness that seemed to absorb the illumination entirely. And then the temperature dropped. It wasn't a gradual chill. It was an instantaneous, freezing plunge that turned the sweat on my neck to ice. The air became so cold that my breath didn't even form a mist. The moisture seemed to freeze and vanish before it could leave my lips. Part 3. The unscheduled arrival. I turned to back away from the ledge, but my boots wouldn't move. The air pressure surrounding my body had suddenly solidified. It felt like being encased in thick, invisible gelatin. Every movement required an immense, agonizing expenditure of physical force. The atmosphere was holding me in place at the very edge of the pit. Then, from deep within the bottomless trench, the visual distortion changed. The absolute blackness began to ripple. A massive, formless presence was rising through the negative space of the pit. It didn't make a sound. There was no roar of an engine, no screech of steel, no mechanical rush. It moved in a terrifying, complete silence that felt entirely unnatural for its size. As it drew closer to the level of the platform, the micro-vibrations in the air reached a terrifying peak. My vision began to pixelate at the edges, dissolving into gray and black static. A sharp, burning pain flared behind my eyes, and a slow, steady stream of fluid began to trickle from my left nostril. The sheer presence of whatever was rising was tearing at my sensory perception, rewriting the geometry of the room. Through the visual static of my own failing vision, I saw the shape outline itself against the dark obsidian of the far wall. It wasn't a train. It was a massive, undulating column of raw, visual gray noise, a solid pillar of shifting, frantic pixels and distorted human silhouettes that seemed to stretch infinitely downward into the earth. It had no face, but within the frantic chaos of the static, hundreds of empty, hollow hollows opened and closed like gasping mouths. A localized gust of freezing air rushed over me, carrying the scent of ancient, stagnant river mud and old iron. I felt a powerful, invisible hand slide over my chest, pressing inward against my ribs with enough force to make my bones flex. It wasn't trying to push me into the pit. It was trying to pull me into the static, to dissolve my physical body into the rising column of gray noise. Part 4. The clothesline. With a desperate, choking heave, I threw my weight backward. The invisible pressure holding my boots tore away with a sickening, internal pop in my ears, and I fell hard onto the polished stone platform. I didn't look back. I crawled on my hands and knees, my vision half blinded by flashing gray shapes, dragging myself toward the narrow rock tunnel. I scrambled up the steep incline, my lungs burning from the thick, pressurized air, until I collapsed through the iron gate back onto the active subway ledge. My partner found me 10 minutes later, sitting in the dirt with my head between my knees, my nose still bleeding onto my high-visibility vest. When I tried to show him the gate, it was gone. There was only solid, seamless granite reinforced with iron rings. No seam, no recess, just ancient cold rock. I resigned from the transit authority the following week. They told me I was experiencing a severe case of deep-level hypoxia brought on by poor ventilation in the river tunnels. They gave me a severance package and told me to get some rest. But I know what I saw. I'm living on the 3rd floor of an apartment complex now, as far away from the ground as I can afford. But every time the subway passes 3 blocks away, I don't just hear the distant rumble. I feel the air in my living room drop in pressure. The air thins out. My vision begins to blur into faint gray pixels at the edges, and I can feel the bottomless trench opening up right beneath my floorboards, waiting for the unscheduled arrival.
If you made it this far into the dark, thank you for hanging out. Investigating these forgotten corners of the internet is always a wild ride, and having you along for the journey makes it a whole lot better. I want to know what you think. Which of these stories gave you that uneasy feeling? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read through them after every upload. and I love seeing your theories on what's actually happening in these threads. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story. Goodbye for now.